We acknowledge the Kaurna people as custodians of the lands and waters of the Adelaide region. We honour their spiritual connection to country and their ongoing cultural authority. We accept that these lands were never formally ceded by the Kaurna people to European settlers. We concede that colonial practice trampled over their control and management of their lives, and disadvantage persists to this day. We commit ourselves to respecting Indigenous leaders and hope that the future brings resolution and improvement to the lives of Indigenous people across the continent we share. I would like to acknowledge our special guests, Mr. Rod Bunton, the husband of our Governor, the Honourable Tung No, MLC, who is attending this evening on behalf of the Honourable Peter Malinauskas, MP, Premier of South Australia. My name is Jenny Deister, and I will MC tonight's oration. This will be my last duty as the outgoing President of the Committee of Management of the Unitarian Church of South Australia. Now, this is the fifth Catherine Helen Spence oration. The woman we are honouring was a preacher at our church, but would be better known as an author, journalist, social reformer, an advocate for electoral reform and poverty relief and girls' education. And at this stage, I think we have to welcome now the Honourable Michelle Lensing, MLC, and she is here to represent the Honourable Vincent Tarzia MP, Shadow Minister for Women and Prevention of Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence. Now, back to Catherine Helen Spence. She was brought up in the Scottish Presbyterian Church, which leans toward the grimmer side of Protestantism, Calvinism. Ms. Jean Brodie described two fellow teachers, adherents of Calvinist theology, as having predestination in their smiles. They, of course, were destined for heaven, but believed their peers, like many of us, would be on the broad primrose path to the everlasting bonfire. Now, Spence was attracted to Unitarianism because of the emphasis on making the world a better place. Freedom, reason, and tolerance were more uplifting preoccupations for her than sin and salvation. Modern Unitarians adhere to those principles. They are less likely to be theist and more likely to come from non-Christian backgrounds, Muslim, Baha'i, Buddhist, or Jewish. There is more emphasis on the interdependent web of existence and the need to care for our planet, but the commitment to justice, equality, peace, and democracy remains essentially the same. The values of Unitarianism are indistinguishable from the concerns of many non-church-going people. We are still a functioning church, because we share the belief that developing humane virtues like honesty, courage, compassion, and self-control, and following a spiritual path is valuable and totally compatible with the pursuit of social justice. Now, Catherine Helen Spence would be delighted to know that our speaker tonight is not the first woman to become Governor of South Australia. She is, in fact, the third. But that said, she is the first to become Governor as a married woman. Dame Roma, of course, never married, and Marjorie Jackson Nelson was, by the time she was Governor, a widow. The practical benefit of this is that she and her husband Rod can share patronages. In fact, he shares 50 patronages with the Governor, who has 200 in her own right. It's busy. Frances Adamson's career path brings enormous breadth to her understanding of how the world works. Her Excellency joined the Australian Public Service in the mid-80s. She was an economist at the Australian Consulate General in Hong Kong from 87 to 91, before moving to London, where she worked at the Australian High Commission to the United Kingdom as a political counsellor for 5 years. She returned to work for the Department of Foreign Affairs in Canberra, and then moved to Taipei, where she was representative to the Australian Commerce and Industry Office for 5 years. She returned to London as Deputy High Commissioner to the United Kingdom from 2005 to 2008. In London, she was Chief of Staff of Foreign Minister Stephen Smith, and when Smith moved to the Defence portfolio, she went with him. Between 2011 and 15, she held the post of Australian Ambassador to the People's Republic of China, the first woman in the position. During her time there, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement was negotiated, and in 2015, Adamson was appointed a foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. On 20th of July 2016, she was appointed Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the DFAT, the first female secretary to be appointed to the portfolio. Despite all these prestigious and demanding roles, family was always a priority. There is a legendary story about when she was in a meeting with Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Her phone rang and she said, "Excuse me, Prime Minister, my daughter is on the phone." Apparently all 3 daughters claim credit for that one. And now Her Excellency will be addressing us on one of the trailblazing women who paved the way for such productive and influential careers as have been pursued by her mother, the late Jennifer Cashmore, and herself. Please welcome Her Excellency, the Honourable Francis Adamson, Governor of South Australia.
Thank you very much indeed, Jenny, for that very warm introduction. I'm going to start in the way I always do on Kaurna country, with an acknowledgement in language. And I do that for several reasons. The first, to show respect for Aboriginal people. The second, to encourage young Aboriginal people, of whom there was a group at Government House this morning, to think about learning the language of their mob. And the third reason is to encourage young people generally to think that learning a language is still a reasonable thing to do, despite the availability of Google Translate and all of those other devices. Kaurna Bogana Alia, Kaurna Miana Alia, Yaichi Miana Alia Kumatana Yartananku. Nautuna Tampani, Kaurna Miana, Yaichi Yatamatina, Bukaninanku, Yalaka, Takarecha. I acknowledge and pay my respects to Aboriginal people, whether from Kaurna country or other lands and regions, and I also acknowledge the Kaurna as the traditional owners from the past, today, and into the future. It's very good of Tung Nor, the Honourable Tung Nor, and the Honourable Michelle Lensink to extend their already long working days by joining us this evening. It's lovely to see you both. And Jenny Deister, let me acknowledge you as outgoing President of the Committee of Management of the Unitarian Church of South Australia. I also acknowledge the Reverend Chris Hanna, Minister, Unitarian Church of South Australia, and His Worship the Mayor of the City of Marion. Friends all. It's a pleasure to be here this evening to deliver the Catherine Helen Spence Oration for 2025. I thank the Unitarian Church for their kind invitation and Chris Hanna for his persistence. Given the breadth of Catherine Helen Spence's interests and causes and her effectiveness in pursuing them, there are any number of organisations in South Australia which might have provided a suitable home for an oration in her name. The fact that the Unitarians have chosen to do so speaks to Catherine Helen Spence's singularity, not least as a Unitarian preacher, but it also speaks to the role of SA Unitarians in encouraging exploration through the medium of the oration of the nexus between liberal religious values and public policy in Australia. At this point, I should caveat my contribution by stating explicitly something which many of you already know, and that is the long-standing convention that governors do not involve themselves in either politics or policy. I note that previous orators have ranged widely, and I propose to do the same. I assure you nonetheless that I shall have something to say, some of it personal, some of it by way of reflections after 4 years as governor. The fact is, I have greatly enjoyed the process of researching Catherine Helen Spence and of thinking not only about the times in which she lived and how she influenced them, but her contemporary relevance. Modern-day governors have the traditional constitutional, ceremonial and community roles, as well as the broader remit to promote their state, including overseas. I have the immense privilege of meeting people across the length and breadth of our state and of being able to gain an understanding of our past, our present and even our future, and of the South Australians who have brought us to where we are today. Governors, to some extent at least, can set their own priorities. I have 6, and they are to support the development of leadership capability in South Australia, civics education in schools, something that Rod is deeply engaged in with me through our schools visit program, South Australia's international engagement, gender equality, Aboriginal reconciliation in ways appropriate for a governor, and local businesses. 3 of these, leadership, civics in schools, and gender equality, are particularly relevant to what I want to say this evening on the subject of Catherine Helen Spence, then and now. My prime source for then is a book written by my late aunt, my mother's elder sister, the historian Dr. Helen Jones, AM. Its title, In Her Own Name, A History of Women in South Australia from 1836, is followed by the all-important words, including the story of women's suffrage. I say a prime source because as a schoolgirl and university student, I regularly visited my aunt, uncle and cousins who lived nearby, often in the company of my mother and my younger siblings, Christine and Stuart. As we arrived, Helen would emerge from her immaculately tidy study where she had been preparing meticulously researched entries for the Australian Dictionary of Biography, documenting the lives of South Australian women, 31 of them in all, or working on her book. It was through time spent with Helen that I came to appreciate what an extraordinary woman Catherine Helen Spence was and how influential she was in South Australian public life, particularly in the reforms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Catherine Helen Spence was a central figure in Helen's history of women in South Australia, and the book itself took years to research and write. My cousin Jennifer recently told me that one evening when Helen was setting the table for dinner, bear in mind we're talking the 1980s, so naturally a woman would be setting the table for dinner, her husband Jeff remarked that she might as well set a place for Catherine Helen Spence. I doubt he meant it as a thought experiment, intriguing though that may have been. It was more a reflection of Helen's single-minded preoccupation with her subject, possibly leading to an occasional sense of exasperation on my uncle's part. Once published in 1986 under the title In Her Own Name, Women in South Australian History, the book became the definitive history of the legal emancipation of South Australian women and its political and social implications. Although quite a few of you here this evening will know a great deal about Catherine Helen Spence, that won't necessarily be true of everyone. In fact, when I mentioned to a woman in her 30s last week that I would be speaking tonight and on what subject, she asked rather apologetically if I could explain who Spence was. Briefly then, and although Jenny's touched on some of these things already, a bit of repetition never hurts when you're trying to sort of remember what's actually happened. Catherine Helen Spence was born in Scotland in 1825 and came to South Australia with her family as a teenager. She has been described as one of the most remarkable women in South Australia's early history, a powerful and persuasive speaker and writer who dedicated herself to public service, becoming a household name during her own lifetime and indeed a nationally known figure. Spence worked as a governess, teacher and author, publishing several novels and, most unusually for a woman, wrote for newspapers. She helped found what was called the Boarding Out Society, finding homes for orphaned, destitute and reformed delinquent children, as they were described, visiting them regularly and bringing up 3 successive families of orphans in her own home. She became a member of the State Children's Council, established in 1886, and later a member of the Destitute Board. She took an interest in children's education and wrote a textbook, The Laws We Live Under, which was studied in South Australian schools. In addition to preaching with the Unitarian Church at home, she lectured and preached in the United States. In 1895, she was appointed to the Commission of Inquiry into the management and condition of the Adelaide Hospital, the first woman in Australia to participate in an official commission. In 1897, she became the first woman in Australia to stand for election to the Federal Convention, which was engaged in the drafting of Australia's constitution. She was unsuccessful, but not deterred from contributing to public debate on electoral reform and the benefits of proportional representation, which she termed effective voting. Spence was involved in the founding, or contributed to the early development, of a number of organisations in South Australia, particular to her times, but also several, such as the National Council for Women, the Country Women's Association and Red Cross, which have found enduring relevance and community support. And I have the pleasure of being patron of all 3. I'll have more to say shortly about Spence's interest in children's education and their safety later in my address. But first, back to Helen Jones's book. A revised and updated edition was published in 1994 to coincide with the centenary of South Australian women being granted the right to vote and to stand for Parliament, something which Catherine Helen Spence had advocated for. In the preface to the 1994 edition, Helen observed that, and I quote, "The emphasis has shifted from the basic right of women to vote towards the need for more women to be in Parliament." She described South Australian history as distinctive and its women's history as having been, quote, "distinguished by pioneering changes in laws relating to women and by their own continuous history of service," end quote. Among the many women involved in organising the centenary celebrations was my late mother, Jennifer Cashmore, who chaired the committee which commissioned the tapestries, recognising, quote, "the efforts of South Australians who, regardless of sex or social and political differences, were united by a common desire for justice and equality of opportunity," end quote. The 2 tapestries hang in the House of Assembly chamber. Mary Lee and Elizabeth Webb Nichols and Catherine Helen Spence's faces prominent as key figures in the campaign for women's suffrage. My mother served as a member of the House of Assembly, only the 3rd woman to be elected to that house from 1977 until her retirement in 1993. She was the 2nd woman in the state to serve as a minister in the Tonkin government of 1979 to 1982, and during that term, the only woman in cabinet and the only woman in the lower house. On 17 February 1993, Jennifer Cashmore moved a motion in the House of Assembly which was carried the same day, noting the significance of the centenary of suffrage and resolving to dedicate space for the tapestries. I quote from the Hansard record of her speech. "The tapestries will acknowledge the role of Parliament in pioneering reforms that have benefited women, including the right to own property, enshrined in the Married Women's Property Act of 1884, the right to vote and the right to stand for Parliament, enshrined in the Constitution Act Amendment Act of 1894, the right of mothers to have equal rights with fathers in the guardianship of their children through the Guardianship of Infants Act of 1940, and the personal and industrial rights of equal opportunity enshrined in the Equal Opportunity Act of 1975." End quote. My mother took the view that the more people can think politically, the more power they have to influence their future in ways of their own choosing. She achieved a great deal both in government and in opposition during her 16 years in Parliament. A public servant wrote to me recently to tell me that at her first Australian Health Ministers' meeting in 1980, she moved a motion that all meetings be smoke-free from that time on. She walked into the room, health ministers were all smoking. So she was pretty good on moving motions, smoke-free from that time on, and that he also said, the public servant who wrote to me, that under her leadership, South Australia was the first state to create a health promotion function within the Health Commission. From time to time, members of the public mentioned to me her work on radiation protection, the state bank collapse, Wilpena Pound, palliative care, or simply how she served them as their local member. In the debate on a condolence motion in the House of Assembly following her death in June last year, it was said of her that she was the best parliamentary orator of her time. She certainly understood the power of the spoken word, just as Catherine Helen Spence did through her preaching, speech-making and lecturing. My sister Christine, brother Stuart and I were encouraged by both our parents to speak and debate around the dining table, at school, and as we started to pursue our chosen careers. Christine became a barrister, Stuart a hospital chaplain, and later a lecturer in chaplaincy. I chose diplomacy. Although I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs in 1985, in the first graduate intake in which there were more women than men, as a woman going to the New South Wales Bar in 1989, Christine was unusual and, to her surprise, treated as a curiosity. She was never led by a female senior counsel, although once appointed Silk herself led younger women. Now, as a judge of the New South Wales Court of Appeal, she still notices how few women's voices are heard as advocates at the appellate level. As a Commonwealth public servant for 36 years, I count myself fortunate to have been in a work environment where I heard the sound of women's voices as well as men's, and to have made my career at a time when it's become more normal for women to have the confidence to speak and not to have others speak on our behalf. Despite South Australia's world-leading suffrage reforms of 1894, over 130 years later, we remain the only state not to have had a female premier, a situation my mother tried and failed to rectify during her parliamentary career. We now, however, see a very different South Australian Parliament than the one Catherine Helen Spence knew. Slow start notwithstanding, there are 17 women in the 47-seat House of Assembly and 11 women in the 22-seat Legislative Council. Following a ministerial reshuffle in September, for the first time in South Australia, there are now more women in Cabinet than men. Lest we think the job now done, it should be noted that at 36%, the proportion of women in our lower house sits well below that of the Commonwealth, New South Wales, Victoria, Western Australia, Tasmania, and the ACT, which has, of course, a unicameral system. Yet, just as Catherine Helen Spence's ongoing advocacy on behalf of women and the example she set provided encouragement to the women of her times, so too does the example of women who are elected as local councillors and members of state and federal parliaments in the 21st century. And just as the South Australian suffragists sought practical ways to advance their cause, Pathways to Politics for Women, a national program run in South Australia by the University of Adelaide, provides practical training, workshops, mentoring and career support to women interested in running for election. The Melbourne-based McKinnon Institute helps prepare women and men, once elected, for appointment to the ministry. I have had opportunities to support both programs as governor and have been pleased to see graduates from the Pathways program already selected as candidates for the state election next March. In fact, 2 South Australian participants in this year's McKinnon program, Rhiannon Pearce and Lucy Hood, were unable to attend their graduation ceremony in Melbourne because I was swearing them in as ministers on the same day. I'm not sure that McKinnon has ever had such quick results before. I am a firm believer in the power of encouragement, the demystification of process, and the acquisition of skills and experience to provide pathways for women to take on leadership roles which enable us to draw on the talents of our whole population. As Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade from 2016 to 2021, the first woman to hold that role, as has been said, I was responsible for leading the implementation of a Women in Leadership strategy developed under my predecessor, Peter Varghese, in response to advocacy by women in the department. They had realised that 30 years of recruiting roughly equal proportions of women and men as diplomatic trainees had not flowed to the leadership of the department, and through a process of consultation, a strategy was developed to bring about change. Although this had broad support across the department, at times there was pushback, necessitating deep listening and open dialogue. What began as a focus on women in leadership developed into a broader diversity and inclusion strategy, and the adoption of ways of working which contributed to a more positive work culture for all staff and, I believe, a more effective foreign service. It was certainly much more representative of the Australian population. Women in particular gained confidence that they could balance work and family responsibilities at levels of seniority which matched their experience and capability, instead of holding themselves back out of concern that higher level responsibility would be unmanageable or incompatible with their roles in bringing up children. During my term as Secretary, and with strong support from my ministers, Julie Bishop and Maurice Payne, female heads of mission, that is, our ambassadors, high commissioners or consuls general, went from around 25% of the total to 45%, with another 5% in the pipeline. I'm not sure we're quite where they're up to today. It's not far off that. Of course, it'll wax and wane over time. Though again, I note there is more to be done. No woman has yet served as Australia's ambassador to the United States of America or High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, despite the Americans and the British sending us female ambassadors and high commissioners. If they can do it, it really makes me wonder why we seem not to be able to. The entry on Catherine Helen Spence in Trailblazers 100 Inspiring South Australian Women recounts her saying at her 80th birthday party, quote, "I am a new woman and I know it. I mean an awakened woman, awakened to the sense of capacity and responsibility, not merely to family and the household, but to the state, to be used not for her own selfish interests, but the world may be glad that she has been born." End quote. As Governor, I have the privilege of meeting and getting to know many women who contribute a great deal to the life of our state in ways small and large. During our regular visits to high schools, Rod and I see growing numbers of girls and young women taking on leadership roles, ironically often now in greater numbers than boys and young men. Giving back, as they describe it, and becoming engaged, active citizens, including in their wider communities. I see women being prepared to be the first and making it easier for the women who come after them, just as Dame Roma Mitchell, South Australia's first female governor, and indeed the first woman in Australia to hold a vice-regal role, did for Marjorie Jackson Nelson, our second female governor, and just as Marge did for me, the third. The same can absolutely be said for Catherine Bennell-Pegg, the first Australian woman to qualify as an astronaut and named just last week as South Australia's Australian of the Year. How wonderful it would be to see her able to carry out a space mission for which she has been trained, inspiring future generations of Australians, young and old, to reach for the stars and supercharging space-related research and the acquisition of STEM skills. Although space travel would have been beyond Catherine Helen Spence's ken, there is much she would recognise about the interplay between elected governments and not-for-profit, or as many of them prefer it, for-purpose organisations in South Australia in the provision of services to those in need. Obviously, there has been an enormous increase in the provision of taxpayer-funded education, health and social services, and the state now carries a heavier burden than it did a century ago. But still there are gaps, and still they are filled at the instigation of people in our community who see a need and want to do something about it. Present-day versions of Catherine Helen Spence. I see them in many of the 180 or so organisations of which I'm patron, either on my own or with Rod. It sounds as if the numbers are becoming a bit exaggerated, actually, but I think that's the accurate number, and Rod has 11 all of his own, and they are looked after, I might say, extremely well. Some of the organisations I have in mind when I say I see them, present-day versions of Catherine Helen Spence, that is, I'd cite in Impact 100 funding projects to support children in state care, find work and housing when they reach the age of 18. Funding a project only a month ago to improve the mental health of communities on Eyre Peninsula and providing after-school activities for young people in Malang. In organisations such as the Channel 7 Children's Research Foundation, which raise funds for medical research. In Operation Flinders and Ice Factor, which work with disengaged young people and help them discover a sense of purpose. In Cystic Fibrosis SA, which helps people with CF find pathways to live longer, healthier lives. And all, or mostly all, funded through donations from South Australians whose generosity continues to amaze me. It won't surprise you either to learn that in 1890, Catherine Helen Spence presented a paper on charity in South Australia to an Australasian conference on charity in Melbourne. I mentioned that I would return to education and the safety of women and children, issues which Catherine Helen Spence, with others, championed. She did not just use her voice, she wrote prodigiously. In the 1870s, this included an editorial and leading article in the Register, the state's first newspaper, which focused attention on what she described as the terror suffered by unknown numbers of women and children at the hands of their husbands and fathers, end quote, and argued for wider legal protection for wives. Reform came slowly, as we know. In the early 1900s, Catherine Helen Spence wrote an article titled Children at Play, Playgrounds and Play Centres, in which she observed, and again I quote, "The children were learning self-respect through the respect that was shown to them and the respect they were led to show to others, not only to their teachers and superiors, but to each other," end quote. Helen Jones draws the conclusion that Spence's quick understanding of the practical implications of education, which in its widest sense was her main concern, enabled her to see the deeper value of play. This was the era of the founding of the Kindergarten Union in South Australia and followed work by Caroline Emily Clark and Catherine Helen Spence and others who recognised the crucial nature of child health, welfare and education, both in humanitarian terms and in its bearing on the future of the society. And of course they sought to enlist government support. These matters still concern us today and are central to the work of the Child Development Council, an independent body established in 2018 to maintain and review South Australia's outcomes framework for children and young people. Embedded in the framework is the Charter for Children and Young People, and Rod and I as patron are pleased to host young Charter ambassadors each year at Government House. As you would expect, there is a long history of vice-regal patronage of organisations which provide a wide range of support to children. Modern-day examples include Can Do for Kids, Childhood Cancer Association, Children's Book Council, Children's Week Association, Legacy, Advancing Youth Foundation, Operation Flinders, Sammy D, Playgroup SA and Youth Opportunities. In our constitutional role, governors and the Governor-General issue letters patent setting the terms of reference for royal commissions, the highest form of inquiry on matters of public importance, and we receive interim and final reports from the Royal Commissioners. The decision to establish a Royal Commission is, of course, taken by the elected government, which is also responsible for responding to the report's recommendations. So far during my term as Governor, 2 Royal Commissions have been established in South Australia. The Royal Commission into Early Childhood Education and Care, led by the Honourable Julia Gillard, which reported in 2023, and the Royal Commission into Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence, led by Natasha Stott-Despoja, which reported in August of this year. If Catherine Helen Spence's advocacy for reform shows us the difference good evidence-based public policy made in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, then, albeit in a different context, the work of both Royal Commissioners points the way to better public policy in the 21st. The terms of reference of the Early Childhood Education and Care Royal Commission were crafted to be forward-looking, with a focus on the first 1,000 days of a child's life. The introduction of universal quality preschool programs for 3 and 4-year-olds and access to out-of-school care. In responding to the report's recommendations, the Premier and Minister for Education said, and I quote, "The need for action is undeniable. Our children are not faring as well as their counterparts elsewhere in Australia, and these children live in families across all walks of life," end quote. The government has moved quickly to establish an Office for Early Childhood Development and is rolling out in stages from next year 15 hours of preschool for all 3-year-olds. It's undertaken to work to build a nation-leading universal early childhood development system that connects families to opportunities to support healthy child development. The government is expected to respond soon to the 136 recommendations contained in the report of the Royal Commission into Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence, which was presented in August. The report is subtitled, "With Courage, South Australia's Vision Beyond Violence." 2 paragraphs leap out at me, and I'm sure any of you who've read the report or even read the first few paragraphs will have had the same reaction. And I'll quote again. "The Commission has heard one message loud and clear. South Australia, once a national leader in tackling domestic, family and sexual violence, has lost its way. This moment is a call to action. It is a chance for South Australia to reclaim its leadership, to rise to the challenge and to honour the vision set by the courageous women who ignited this work over 100 years ago." End quote. They are 2 paragraphs from the report, which I've quoted in full. Of course, when we talk about courageous women who ignited this work over 100 years ago, the Royal Commission is clearly thinking, at least in part, of Catherine Helen Spence. She was one of those women. To answer the question left hanging at her 80th birthday party, we can be very glad today that she was born and took the path of a new woman. Let me conclude with the following. As Helen Jones pointed out, at the time of South Australia's centenary in 1936, Dr. Helen Mayo, a prominent medical practitioner and the second woman to gain a medical degree from the University of Adelaide, said, and again I'm going to quote, "South Australia has been fortunate in its citizens, both men and women, who took the long view, who built up for the future, and who gave of themselves unsparingly for the common good." End quote. With the state's bicentenary in 2036, it is worth thinking now, as a community, about what we want to be able to say in 11 years' time that we have achieved, and doing all we can to ensure our children are set up to succeed and that we end domestic, family and sexual violence. Catherine Helen Spence then, South Australians now and in future. Thank you.